I thought, this is great. We're going to show this at the King Center. I met with all the black leaders in Atlanta from the churches, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and all of them were so behind this. And I got a call a few days later, sorry, we have to suspend the invitation. I said, why? He said, because Coca-Cola funds the King Center. They fund Spelman College, which is the big black women's college in Atlanta. And I met with the dean. I'm like, she said 50% of our incoming class of 18-year-olds has a chronic disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, whatever. I said, then why are there Coke machines all over the campus? Literally just put up your cup and get your Coke. She said, because we're funded by Coca-Cola. This is called The Big Picture, which is a powerful effort that is done by University of San Francisco professor and local kids in San Francisco to talk about how they're targeted and how this affects them. I don't know if we can show the video here. Can we show it? Can you turn it up a little bit, please? And they had these spoken word poems by various kids who were affected by this issue.
I went to Roosevelt Middle School. My daily routine was to wake up hungry, walk to the bus stop, past McDonald's, the liquor stores, past Popeyes, past the first Burger King, catch the 38 to the second Burger King, order my favorite round hash browns and watch the young brown bodies drool. And I don't know if we loved Burger King or just loved not being hungry anymore. Because breakfast before school wasn't a requirement, but having to focus through 6 periods was. During PE, I remember we had to run the mile. But luckily, my first year, that turned into laps on our medium-sized area on the roof. I jogged, skipped mostly. But my second year, we had to run a mile around Rossi Park. I had already alerted my teachers that this was gonna be my revolutionary act to walk the mile. Truth is, my asthma would finish me before I could finish this race. I lost friends by the block. In the end, it was us. The fattest girl and fattest boy in the class, and he chose silence and I chose comedy, so by default, I had more friends than him. Tatiana, they screamed. You better not let him beat you. We looked at each other.
You get the idea, right? It's pretty disheartening when you see how these populations are targeted. Anybody's interested in learning more about it, I did a talk at the Harlem Riverside Church a few months ago on Martin Luther King's anniversary of his assassination. It's online. It's called, just Google food oppression Hyman. You'll see it. And I talk about these issues in more detail. But Coca-Cola is smart. I mean, they gave $10 million to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to oppose a soda tax. Finally, it did pass, but that's the kind of stuff they do. But there was a study that was shown that last year that in Philadelphia, in a follow-up to their tax, there was a 40% reduction consumption in soda. Energy drinks were 64% lower. Bottled water was 58% higher. And the 30-day soda consumption was about 40% lower. So they work. That's why the soda industry is against them. All right, so that was all the depressing news. Let's talk about what we can do about it. Yay. Okay. So I'm writing a new book. It's called Food Fix, How to Save Our Health, the Economy, our Climate, and Communities. Because it's all linked, right? It's all one big problem. What's happening here was just a slice. It's one chapter in the book. But what's going to happen is I'm going to connect the dots for everybody to see how what we eat links to everything that matters and what we care about and how to fix it. Follow the money, right? You got to follow the money. Dr. Dariush Mazafarian is the dean of Tufts School of Science and Nutrition Science and Policy, wrote this review on conflict of interest and how do we get this out of the science. And he gives a series of recommendations. You got the slides, allow you to kind of read it. But essentially it's looking at how do we change the way we do science to insulate scientists from the corruption of the food industry. What barriers can be put in place, what levels of integrity. So there are, for example, conflict of interest and disclosure guidelines for many journals, although many things aren't disclosed. But what needs to happen is not just disclosures, but actually active management of those guidelines. In other words, how do you mitigate that conflict of interest if you're a scientist? And there are ways to do that. So what can we do on the government level? Well, this was, again, the effort of me and Dariush Mazafarian talking to congressmen and congresswomen about the lack of coordination of all the different agencies that are involved in governing food policy and how they're often at odds with each other and undermining our public health and undermining our financial stability as a nation. And how do we then analyze and fix these things? So they wrote this letter that went to the Government Accountability Office, and hopefully within the next year or so, we're going to have a report which is going to show how all these things are linked. For example, you've got the CDC influencing food policy and guidelines, the National Institute of Health regulating what gets researched. You've got the Department of Human Health and Services involved in a lot of aspects, for example, around what we fund in Medicare and Medicaid. We're trying to develop a food pharmacy concept where we're providing free food that's paid for in order to reverse diabetes, and there's been examples of this. The FDA can change labeling. Medicare can change what they're funding, as I said. The FTC can do a better job of regulating food marketing. The Department of Defense. I mean, I was talking to Sonia Angel and said, we changed our procurement policies in New York, meaning we're not going to buy junk food. We're going to buy healthy food for all the institutions and groups that we support, right? Whether it's schools or whatever it is. So the Department of Defense and many of these other government agencies buy huge amounts of food that they provide for the activities of the government and their employees. Well, what if they said, we're only going to buy healthy food. We're only going to buy food that meets these criteria, that protects humans, protects the planet, protects the environment, and our economy. That would be a big change. The USDA, again, dietary guidelines need to change. All these things can change, and we can actually influence policy. So the NIH just developed a nutrition research task force to talk about how we advocate for a better nutrition research agenda. It's pretty much a non-thing happening in the NIH. How do we reform the Farm Bill and reform SNAP and move agriculture to more regenerative agriculture, where we're actually restoring the soil, restoring our water supplies, producing better food that's better for you, better for the planet, and better for everybody? How do we then think about what do we tax and incentivize? Do we tax soda, for example, and processed food, and incentivize the consumption of fruits and vegetables? There are a lot of strategies that have been put out that can really have an impact. How do we fix our dietary guidelines? I mean, this is actually what we tell people to do on the left and actually what we fund on the right? So we tell people to eat all this healthy stuff, but fruits and vegetables are 0.45% of funding, and we're told to eat 50% of them in our diet. Well, how does that sync up, right? This is from Shelley Pingree, who's a congresswoman who's really great. How do we reform the dietary guidelines based on good science? How do we revise the checkoff programs and focus on research? Maybe we put a levy on the food industry and gather that money for research from them and do it independently. Maybe there's billions of dollars we can get through basically these levies instead of using them to promote products which have little science to back them up. Why don't we actually use that money to fund science that's going to tell us what's really going on? How do we reform our nutrition labels to actually make sense and not be so confusing? How do we stop the marketing of foods to the kids through the FTC? And how do we deal with the real problem, which is money in politics? I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the Congress in 2019, there's a new bill called H.R. 1, House Resolution 1, for this Congress that really went into great detail in how do we reform campaign finance laws? How do we get money out of politics? It is one of the single biggest problems, because imagine a world where that didn't exist. Well, I recently was in Abu Dhabi because we're going to be opening Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine there at the Cleveland Clinic. And I met with the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is basically they get all the money that's excess after paying for everything. There's no taxes. Ooh, got an email. There's no taxes, or maybe that's saying my time's up. There's no taxes for anybody. There's no taxes for businesses. There's funding of all the public services and health care and education. It's free, basically. And they have a massive obesity problem there. It's like 1 in 4 to 1 in 6 have diabetes. 70% or more are overweight. And I met with this guy as the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I said, well, what are you guys doing about this? He says, well, we put in 100% tax on energy drinks, and we put in a 50% tax on soda. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I said, wow. He said, yeah, Red Bull called me, and they're like, we've seen a 70% reduction in our sales, and we're going to have to lay off our 800 employees. You've got to stop this. He's like, no, I don't, and thank you very much, because they are not beholden to anybody. They don't get any money from the food industry. They don't get any money that influences their behavior, and they're trying to do the right thing. And they're an autocratic country, which is nice for doing some things. I mean, I think, I think Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. But I don't...